Yeah.
How many fellows do you have? Thanks. So what's the second year clinical?
We changed it now. We had first one, the second year that I was not so things.
Yeah, they got.
Because that is to get people. Yeah, because we have conservators like this, we were not so pleased with.
Yeah, like they should.
Is out of there.
Do your second year.
Everybody else.
Okay. All right. Good morning. Welcome to Monday morning epilepsy grand rounds. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Birgit Frauscher. Dr. Frauscher is a professor of neurology, biomedical engineering, and director of the Comprehensive Epilepsy Center at Duke University Medical Center. Her research lab's interests include development of novel seizure-independent EEG markers for the epileptogenic zone, the investigation of important interactions between sleep and epilepsy, and the use of unique possibility of invasive intracranial EEG for studying brain physiology during wakefulness and sleep in order to better delineate normal from abnormal intracranial EEG activity. Dr. Frauscher attended medical school and did her initial training in Austria. She then further went to the Montreal Neurological Institute and McGill University in Canada to further study intracranial EEG and signal analysis. Subsequently, she served there as staff and later as group leader of epilepsy and professor of neurology for 10 years. Her scholarly endeavors have earned her several prestigious awards, including the Clinician Scientist Award of the FRSQ, the Michael Prize of the International League Against Epilepsy, and the Ernest Niedermeyer Prize from the Austrian Epilepsy Society. She has published close to 200 peer-reviewed articles with an H-index of more than 70. Thank you so much, Dr. Frauscher, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil and team, for the kind invitation to actually physically visit Cleveland. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And on today's talk, I will focus on trends and innovations in SEEG. I have no disclosures relevant to today's talk. And the motivation to decide to give a lecture of SEEG, okay, is twofold. The one thing is that's the only thing I truly understand in medicine, but then maybe the second one is that SEEG is now a global phenomenon, and that is work from John Thomas from the lab that we published last year in Epilepsy, where we did a survey, and I have to say I usually never do surveys, but that was one of the first where we really wanted to find out about different practices in SEEG around the globe. And basically, we surveyed a total of more than 350 centers. 150 of those were located in the US. And here you can see the number of centers. In red, it's the saturated when it's more than 20 in a given country. And then what we have here is also the volumes, right? And that is quite interesting. So if we look at the upper end, so it's around 10% that do more than 40 cases a year. Duke is one of them. And then you have also centers who are more low volume, below 10. And so you really see there is a huge variability in cases done. So the other motivation why we need to innovate in SEEG is that surgical outcomes, I think, to be fair, I think they are good, because if we think these are difficult to treat patients, and if we achieve an angle 1 outcome or a good seizure outcome in 50% of patients, one can really say that's good. That's not what neuromodulation achieves, and that's not what traditional medical management achieves. However, I really hope we can do better. This is from a meta-analysis done in the lab where we really subtracted patient-specific information from the literature. And this is the part on SEEG, which is comprising more than 1,000 cases. And there you can really see vast variability if we look at angle 1 outcome depending on anatomy. And then we all very well know that it's not only anatomy, but then also pathology. But if we look in this review, even for the typical easy case, the so-called mesiotemporal lobe epilepsy, the question is it really so easy if you need to implant? Well, maybe yes, in the dominant lobe, but only 60% of patients become seizure-free. So I think we can do better there, and that's the motivation for today's talk. What I want to do is fourfold: to discuss diversity in SEEG practice across the world and solutions for standardization, then review pitfalls and solutions of the inherent sampling limitation of SEEG. And that's not only SEEG, that's also the same for subdural grids and strips, because it's an illusion to think that you really cover everything. Then to understand the added value of quantitative inter-ictal EEG. I will not focus on the quantitative ictal EEG. And then to illustrate a pilot project to see how we could benefit from big data in SEEG. Okay, so this is now a bit crowded and contains several information. Again, that's from that survey that we did globally. And so we obtained more than 300 expert responses from 39 countries. And not surprisingly, there were different practices, and that was quite interesting for us to see. And let's start here, because this center is founded by Dr. Lüders. Let's start here just with how we define the epileptogenic zone. And so we were interested to see, is it now that SEEG got adopted? Is it now the Banco definition that got adopted, or is it still the Lüders prevailing? And what we could find in that survey, we found it's a fun fact that really the majority of centers, 70%, chose the Lüders one. Might very well be, as it's really a pragmatic one, which is very useful for our surgical doing. Now, also experts preferred ictal features more than interictal features. I don't think it's a big surprise. Seizure onset patterns were attributed high importance. And what we felt was a bit surprising is if we look at computational features, then only 23% of experts suggested additional computational features. I will come back to that later, and I really feel that is where we could have room to improve. Again, this here is the terminology variation across sites for definition of the epileptogenic zone. And then here I listed the different countries. And so I was a little bit surprised to see that in the United States, there was a little bit more prevailing for the definition of Banco. Maybe that's the influence of Patrick Chauvel, could very well be the case. Now, another fun fact, let's go to my home country, Austria. There it's prevailing for Lüders. But that's just some small details. All the data are available on our GitHub repository if somebody wants to play around. Evidently, there was also discrepancy in terminology. People could not agree on what is the definition of the seizure onset zone, something that should be pretty straightforward, but apparently it's not. Experts stated, yes, there is confusion. What is the difference between the SOC, EC? They use it the same way, they use it differently. And then experts could not even agree on what is low voltage fast activity. You know, some experts said 24% said if it's above 13, 50% said it needs to be above 30. So you really see that there is not so much consensus if we look around, and I feel that is a problem. Now, again, what we can see here is, and that was also interesting, we then first of all looked at the geographical location of the training of the experts, but then also the years of expertise, and that also was influential in the choice of features. I before already mentioned the additional suggestions, and that's not surprising that if we look here, so there is vast predominance on the epileptogenicity index developed by the group of Fabrice Bartholomé out of Marseille. Also, people listed the fingerprint from Patrick Chauvel from the Cleveland Clinic, simple spectral analysis, white matter connectivity, source imaging, gamma activity, functional area positioning. So again, so a lot of things to do, as only 23% of expert listed something here. Again, as mentioned, all the data is available online on our GitHub repository if you want to do more analysis on them. So what does that mean, right? It's great. And I'm wondering if Banco and Talarach would have foreseen that now in 2025, really SEG became such a global phenomenon. This is great. But now we have all the different schools, the different nomenclature. So now how can we even collaborate across sites? And in order to do so, I really feel we need a standardized terminology. And if we look in the literature, we are not the first, right? We don't reinvent the wheel, but we have good examples if we think about clinical EEG terminology, or an amazing job done by Larry Hirsch out of Yale for the ACNS ICU EEG guidelines, right? The first step is to standardize, and then we can study the significance of the different findings in a second step. And that is exactly what the IFCN plan to do. So there is currently a task force ongoing to develop a unified SEG terminology. And so in summer 2023, so you can see it takes a lot of time and effort, a 39 expert panel was assembled. I, together with Sandor Benitsky, serve as facilitators of that task force to agree on nomenclature standards. Now, what is the way how we do that? We decided to go for a Delphi process. We are currently in round 3, soon entering round 4. So it's very time consuming, but I feel that Delphi, and for all of you who participated in those will agree with, it's a good thing if it's a topic where there is a lot of discrepancy. The way how it works is basically you have an orientation session to focus down and nail down the problem, then another meeting on the topic, and then basically questions gets an idea gets written, and then basically they get individually distributed to the members of the task force, who can then agree, disagree, make alternative suggestion, and so it goes round to round until majority with more than 2/3 is achieved. And so we hope, I still have hope that we might finish by summer next year. But then the outlook from that would be it would allow to really collaborate across sites because then we speak the same language. It would also allow large-scale multi-center projects that then can identify the significance of certain features because now we are at the descriptive stage, but then we would go back to really see their significance. It can also serve as gold standard if we benchmark algorithms. And yeah, that's on this topic. I think another important topic, and I was thinking about that now since several years, is we have more and more automatic tools. And, you know, with every spike detector, HFO detector, you will always find a channel which has the highest rate, right? That's the nature of the beast. And then you can rank it. But you only see what you explore. In other words, where you don't have an electrode, you don't know what's happening. And it's an illusion to think, even if you put 16, 18 electrodes, that you have a good coverage, right? We once did the math and we came up that you explore around 10% of the cortex. Evidently, that number is underestimating because usually we are not implanting blindly, right? Or at least that's not what we should do. Usually we have a very good idea and a hypothesis, and then dependingly we implant. But still, there is a lot of blind spot because these electrodes, it's like the light in a tunnel where it's enlightened, it's very clear, but then even a centimeter or more away, we don't see what's happening. And that's a big issue, and that's a fundamental issue. And I think before we look at quantitative features in what we have recorded, we should first make sure, did we explore what we need to explore to make a good choice and have a realistic chance to identify the seizure onset zone? So that here is a simple scheme that shows what's happening with our implantations, right? So we can have three scenarios. We can have this scenario A, so in red is the seizure onset zone depicted, in blue it's the propagation zone, and then in green we put some eloquent cortex. That's just a scheme here, but what we can see here in that first scenario here, we have a perfect coverage. Now, how often does that happen? I would say it only happens in lesional epilepsy. It's rare that we have that. I think in most of the cases, we are more in that scenario, which means it's a partial coverage, right? I think that's something which is realistic. Now, sometimes things go wrong and we are all aware of that, and oops, we completely missed the boat. That's an issue because probably and most likely we always will have a seizure onset zone if we define seizure onset zone as where we can see in our EEG the first changes at the onset of a seizure, right? But so I think that is something where we need to be very humble and always be aware that we have that three scenarios and probably we have a partial coverage, and be very careful that we don't have a seizure onset, which is an apparent seizure onset, but not the true seizure onset. And I think that's the main issue. And why is that an issue? Because seizures are propagating events, right? And so you always will have a seizure onset zone. I mean, I think there were 1 or 2 cases of the hundreds that I reviewed where that was not the case, but usually you always have that. And that's just a couple of examples to highlight what we face in clinical practice, right? So this was one of my patients a couple of years ago, where then we identified in the inferior occipital lateral neocortex of focal cortical dysplasia type 2. That is basically what is explored here. It was non-lesional. And basically this here is in the supracalcarine cortex, okay? So that's an issue. So now if we, for example, would say we don't have these electrodes here, right? We see a low voltage fast activity here. So low voltage fast activity doesn't mean you're at the good spot, right? It can also occur in propagation areas. And so what is very important if you look at a seizure onset is you need to look at the whole gestalt of the seizure. And what you can nicely see, and I think that's a discriminating feature here, is that in this true seizure onset zone, we see that buildup of the rhythmic spiking here before then the low voltage fast activity kicks off. And then whereas here, you don't see much here, but then out of the blue comes the low voltage fast activity, which is a sign of propagated activity. But so we need to be very careful, right? Because this has huge consequences for the patient. With this resection, she didn't have a visual field deficit. With this one, she would have a visual field deficit plus not even be seizure free. It's a double lose. I don't think she would be too happy about that. This is another good example where we were nearly missing, but then we didn't miss. So we thought this is a typical left mesiotemporal lobe epilepsy. That's what we said. But then due to whatever reasons, Dr. Dubois at that time decided, yes, but let's also explore the contralateral. Let's put 2 sentinel electrodes in the amygdala and hippocampus there. And so we did do that. And as you can nicely see, let's ignore these 2 electrodes for effect. What you can nicely see here, that you have that high amplitude spike and that near DC shift and then the low voltage fast activity. I think if I see that, I would be pretty convinced, yes, we are at the good spot. It's all perfect. And there were evidently no clinical symptoms preceding that onset. However, what we then saw surprisingly in the SEEG is that indeed it started on the right side, and then after a couple of seconds it speeded up here, and then it propagated more so on the left side, and that's why on the scalp EG the changes were seen left. I'm not saying this is a frequent scenario, but we nearly missed the side, which wouldn't have been a good thing. This is another issue we had. So we had here in mesiotemporal structure the remnants of a lesion, a gliotic lesion. Patient already had a resection, and so she continues to have seizure, and we felt the remnant of the lesion is the culprit. And so we wanted to do an SEEG, but there we had a technical issue, namely that our surgeon, unfortunately, during the procedure, due to gliotic conditions, was unable to place an electrode exactly at the good spot. So then at the end, we ended up to not explore what we primarily wanted to explore, but just the surroundings. And indeed, that's then what we get, propagation patterns. But in this case, it was at least the good thing is that the clinical onset was before the EEG onset, right? So then it's at least a clear-cut case. We are not there, but otherwise it could be problematic. And again, at seizure onset, again, it was this not very well sustained low voltage fast activity that came kind of out of the blue, no nice buildup, but just to show some examples. Now, so there is that problem, and now evidently you can say, oh, yes, I'm expert, and therefore, you know, depending on the whole gestalt, depending on this or this, so it's pretty easy to see if you're there or not. But we were thinking, is it possible to develop a tool that the implantation is completed, we then record a couple of minutes, and then basically we know if we have a good implantation or not. So that was the goal. That was the goal of one of my master students at the time. He now switched to Duke to do a PhD with me, but that was the goal of his master work that he then published last year. So what we did do is we evidently, for the inputs, took spike gamma. Spike gamma is nothing else than a spike that is preceded with gamma activity between 30 to 100 hertz. It's like this pointe moustache. And so I will show you a couple of examples later, but that's basically what we used, and we used that because we know that spikes are very sensitive but not very specific for the epileptogenic zone, whereas that spike gamma was shown to be very sensitive. So then what we did is we detected on our bipolar channels this spike gamma. And then what we did, very simple, we then sorted this channel from highest to lowest spike and computed the Euclidean distance to the maximum spike, because evidently we assumed if we follow the power law hypothesis that you should get such a slope, because with the distance the spike rate should decrease. So that's the perfect example with a good fit. And in red is here the seizure onset zone, in blue the non-seizure onset zone. And that's, for example, a poor fit, right? This is not a nice curve, as you can see here. What we then did in the next step is we then virtually removed this seizure onset zone in that step. And then basically this is before the slope, this is after. So you see a huge difference in case of a good sampling or a good fit. Whereas in that scenario here, you don't see much difference. So that's basically the concept underlying this model. So now for this here, we still needed the seizure onset zone, something we wanted to avoid, right? Because we want to use it right after the OR. And that's then what we did by then doing channel by channel computations of all of these measures to compute this perturbation indices. And basically what we did is we computed this perturbation strength in relationship to the channel with the highest spike gamma rate. And then at the end, what we did then to get our images is we then build a perturbation centroid. This is very simple, the mean of all channel coordinates with a perturbation strength greater than the 70th percentile. That's what we arbitrarily chose. And then basically you can put all this framework in this image, because I wanted to have a spatial perturbation map, an easy image. I can have a look and then know, is it a good or a poor implantation? And basically you have here the channels. Again, they are listed with the perturbation strength, and this here is the distance. And basically, if you're in the diagonal like this, if it's a picture like this is a perfect implantation, whereas otherwise it's not. I show you some examples on how this can be translated. Again, all the code is available, open access on our GitHub page, and also the data to recreate the model. But basically, let's start with this patient. This, I remember this patient. It's one of mine, a 26-year-old. She had a right mesoparietal resection resulting in an angle 1A outcome. Pathology was FCD type 2A. She's seizure-free without medication now. But here the point is that this spatial perturbation map closely resembles the ideal diagonal matrix. And so the model indicated this was of excellent quality. Indeed, we had 3 electrodes inside the dysplasia because it was suspected from the imaging, but not 100%. And we already wanted to implant with the strategy to do radiofrequency thermocoagulation on her. But that's an example of where we saw that we had an excellent coverage. Let's go to this example here. So that doesn't look how it should be, that the maximum is here in that diagonal of the first quadrant. That looks different. So this is a patient, difficult case, 40-year-old, palliative right temporal resection, not a good outcome, angle 3. And in the phase 1, it was even inconclusive for lateralization, but focus was either parietal, temporal-parietal. And so we did a bilateral implantation of the temporal-parietal regions. And so according to the model, there was a partial sampling, but that also fits that he didn't become seizure-free. Now, the third case I want to show, that's an interesting one, because in this case, it's a female who underwent 2 SEEG implantations a couple of years later. And so this is basically that spatial perturbation map in the first implantation, where clearly also the clinicians evidently realized that the boat was kind of missed and therefore no resection was proceeded. It's a case which points to the posterior cortex. But then the patient did not do well, so we decided to implant again and then to more densely cover the posterior temporal-occipital cortex. And this time we got that improved map. It's not perfect, but much better. Based on that, we then did do a resection. She has an angle 1B outcome. But that's just showing some examples on how it could be useful, or at least having it into mind, it can help. Now, as a disclaimer, this model was developed for unifocal cases, and that's also how the model is developed. You should apply it. And it was developed in people above age 15. So I don't know yet the result from children, but we should have it very soon. Now I want to talk a bit about the added value of quantitative inter-ictal EEG, and I think there is really a high use case, because to me it's always, okay, I understand why we are so interested in seizure, because basically that is what is bothering the patient, that is what needs to be treated, and that's why the patient underwent resection. But then what I think is counterintuitive is that seizures are one of the most propagating events. And so maybe it's better to look for something that remains more stable in the focus and is then better and easier for us to identify. And this is a concept that many people, including our lab, now follow, because first of all, up to 60% of patients continue to have seizures after curative epilepsy surgery, and that number is high in extratemporal as opposed to temporal lobe epilepsy. That's just some data from what I showed before. And evidently, if we look at that inter-ictal EEG, we have many candidate markers that range from traditional spikes, high frequency oscillations. Agree that the hype phase is already a little bit over for this one. But then, and I want to discuss more the latest features, like spike with fast activity. What I mean is either spike gamma or spike ripple. I will show you some results on that. Then also something we didn't do too much in our field of epilepsy is normative mapping, something that is usually done in other diseases, but that is something only recently came up, and probably because we didn't have quantitative normative data available for SEEG. Evidently, epilepsy is a network disease, and we know that since many years. So connectivity markers make a lot of sense to explore. And then we also know that epilepsy is not one disease. There are many different types, and therefore maybe you need different markers for different diseases, and therefore also a multi-marker approach makes sense. And I will touch base a little bit what other groups and our group did. Now, actually, this spike gamma is not something that we invented. If you go back in the fringe literature, it's something that was described as point moustache from a pure visual EEG analysis at the time. And it's exactly that you have this fast activity associated with the spike. And that's an indicator that you are probably more closely in the epileptogenous zone or seizure onset zone here. And basically that is something the first time quantitatively showed by the group of Greg Worrell at Mayo Clinic in 2015, where they found that this is very predictive to be part of the seizure onset zone. Now, what was our group's contribution is that Sean, who was at the time a postdoc in the lab, was interested to investigate a total of 135 spike features, all fully automatically, to see if there are some spike features that do better than others to identify the epileptogenic zone. Because I always had the feeling when I look at the SEEG that sometimes I feel really that spikes are much better than if I look at seizures, because sometimes, particularly if we look at frontal lobe seizures, it's a vast network activation which goes very, very rapidly. And so I felt there must be something more to it, depending on how you look at the spikes. So that's the motivation why we did that project with 135 features. It's all features that either were described in the literature or that make sense from a signal analysis point of view. But then at the end of the day, we found, and I was excited to see that this spike gamma is the best feature. And I liked it because it's something that's visually accessible. And that is the case because so far we only used it computationally, fully automatically detected, but we hopefully will soon have another paper where we looked at that spike gamma with different raters from different schools and really were able to show that it is reliably identifiable. Evidently, it's easier if you have time frequency plots because sometimes you need to be careful to distinguish this spike gamma from spike filtering effect. I'm not going to talk about that here, but basically, that's the nice reputation where you have here a spike artifact, which is preceded here by this isolated island blob in the gamma spectrum. And we found that did pretty well. This was a study we did together with Philippe Kahan and our center in 83 patients. And then we found that channels who had a spike gamma rate exceeding 2 per minute had an 80% probability of being in the EC. So this is one thing that we as clinicians should pay attention when looking at interictal EEG. That's just a couple of examples, right, where we plotted. So this is a patient where we see the redder, the higher the rate of wake spike gamma. And so here we see it's part of the resection, the patient is seizure-free. In this patient here, you see that's a bimesiotemporal case, but only one side was removed, not the rest, which makes evidently sense. But at that time, the assumption was it was a unilateral epilepsy, but the patient had a poor outcome. And in retrospect, we found that spike gamma would have been on both sides. And then in that patient here, you see there is no spike gamma in what has been removed. Again, none of these surgeries was based on the spike gamma. This is a retrospective analysis, but just to show how it nicely correlates. Another interesting aspect, and that's a study where we had the pleasure to work together with Kat Chu from MGH, was where she was interested to collect 109 patients from 4 centers and then look at a measure which is called spike ripple. So it's also a fast activity, but the ripple is of higher frequencies exceeding 80 hertz. And what she could show here is really that this spike ripple measure is significantly better than ripple or fast ripple HFOs alone. And that also makes sense. And I think it's a much more robust marker because those of you who do HFOs, even in intracranial EEG, it's really quite complex during wakefulness because we do find artifacts even in the intracranial EEG. And so that spike is much more robust in that regard. But that's what she found independently of what we had. Now let's discuss a little bit normative mapping. So basically, we couldn't do that because there was no atlas. And that's an idea Sean Gottman, I think, had 25 years ago. But then I remember I came first for a 2-year research stay, and then it became longer and longer. But evidently, at the end of that stay, when I finished the project that I was supposed to do, I said, oh, I have still 3 months, so I can do something else. And he said, oh, yeah, so you can do this project. And I naively participated in that project, but it turned out to be quite a nice project where we wanted to build that atlas of normative activity across the different states of vigilance. That's data, small data. It's more than 100 subjects from 3 centers, from the MNI, from the CHUM, and from Grenoble-Alpes University. So we put these data together, and what we can see, that's from wakefulness, that there is a caudal-rostral transients with lower frequencies in occipital lobe and faster frequencies in the frontal lobe. That's something you all know, and that's something a new trainee starts. You always need to explain when you are in the primary motor cortex. No, that's not pathological fast activity. That's physiological sustained 25 hertz fast activity as we usually see in that location. All of that data are open available either to visually inspect them or to download them. But then the beauty from that atlas is, and this is as normal as it can be, right? Because it's still an epileptic brain, otherwise we wouldn't implant. But basically that were channels that were outside the seizure onset zone, outside of lesional tissue, didn't have a slow wave anomaly, and did not have spikes that as was identified over a 24-hour period review by 2 neurophysiologists. And basically, what we came up with is, at least in that data set, around 20% of channels fulfilled that criterion. That makes sense. We always put also electrodes in potential propagation pathways, and also for creating the margins of the resection. But again, so now we have this atlas. There are others now around out of Penn from the UK. And basically you could pull all that data and then use this basically to then normalize. That's just an example, and papers have been published on that from the group of Peter Taylor from the UK and the group of Brian Litt at Penn. But that's just an example how you could use it, right? Because basically for whatever band, right, you could at different regions, you could simply plot it. And then, for example, look at deviations in certain regions, and basically here we saw a large deviation in that region here. Effect size was very large, 0.97, and that happened to be part of the epileptic focus. So you know, traditionally in epilepsy we always look for the abnormality, but maybe we also should look for deviations from normalcy, and that can be, as we know now, that you have less epileptic spindles also in the epileptic focus. And that could be quite a nice feature to check. This is a latest work we did with this atlas, where we were thinking maybe, you know, we should not only be interested in the oscillatory component of spectrum, but also the non-oscillatory or 1/f function. And that was work that we did do there. Again, we used as a base the MNI atlas for the normalization, and then we looked at deviations. But that's just some ideas which could be very interesting. And what we could see here, that the H or Hurst exponent achieved highest performance. Balanced accuracy was 0.76 for classifying resected versus non-resected channels in the good outcome patient. But that's just the beginning. There is a lot of different measures that we can look at. Now, if we look at connectivity, there is a lot of work out, and out of convenience, I took one paper from our collaborators, where we collaborated together with Wojciech Travnicek from the Brno Epilepsy Center. And he looked at a measure, but there are many others out. That's just one example to show that it's interesting to look at connectivity at entropy. And for the trainees, maybe entropy is a measure of the disorder of a system or energy unavailable to do work. And so basically you have a low entropy if you have a solid system, but then in a gas where it's all disordered, you have a high entropy. Now let's go back again to our field, which is EEG. So I depict here what we have. So here, there is a channel here in the seizure onset zone and adjacent to. And if you look, you can see that the signal is quite different. So there is a high entropy. Whereas if we look here, it's nearly an identical system. So you have a low entropy. And that is basically the concept behind that work of Wojciech. And you can create that entropy in whatever frequency band you wish. I think he found that the relative entropy in the ripple band between 80 to 250 hertz achieved a very good area under the receiver operating curve, as you can see here. And there is advantage, right? Because you could say, okay, we have HFOs, why not do there? But there is advantage because this is easy. You can just take the full signal, you put it in, you don't require any patient level normalization, and it's very easy and fast to compute because of its clear and straightforward definition. The other aspect I mentioned, and again, there are now several papers out to look at multi-marker approaches, and that's something you could do even with simple machine learning algorithm that was based on a simple SVM model at the time. that we got interested. That was Petter, who was a postdoc in the lab. Then he left. Now he came back after a couple of years, and now he is again with us at Duke to work with us. But at the end, we looked at different groups: oscillatory event, high frequency oscillation, univariate features, bivariate connectivity measures, and interictal discharges, and put all of that together. And the only thing you see here in the ROC curve is, and again, that's not surprising, that if you put in several markers, you do better as any single marker, which kind of makes sense, as again, not every patient has the same pathology or location of the epileptic generator. Now, that's latest work from their group in Czech. That's Petter Nečedli, who is the first author on this one, which is a further development. So the first step of that multi-marker approach was a simple, easy SVM approach. But what he does do here is he extracts the same interictal markers, but then he combines these traditional univariate markers with the spatial distance using graph neural networks, which is a more a complex machine learning algorithm, which is very interested for that doing. And they could now, in this first study, it's a small study, it's only 80 patients, single-centric, of course, needs validation in multi-center studies, which is currently underway, but they could find a really good area under the curve in this model, just to show that there is a lot going on also with machine learning AI. But again, and that talk today is not on AI, but one needs to be always very careful. How was it done? Was the model overtrained, etc., etc.? I'm not going into that, but I felt that was an interesting approach, and I feel it makes total sense to use this graph neural networks because epilepsy is a network disease in itself. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I want to illustrate how one could benefit from big data in SEEG. And that was an idea that we had together with John and Jean Thomas at the time, where we were interested, you know, how it is in clinical doing. So we have, I mean, no center, particularly not in the US, has huge experience with SEEG, right? Because it only is here since a couple of years, not many decades like in France. And then we have many centers, and a lot of centers have low volumes. And so how we proceed is we learn from our experience as physician, right? Like we all remember the scenario that we sit in seizure conference, and then one colleague with more experience says, oh, I remember I saw a similar case 10 years ago or whatever, and that is what we did at that time, blah, blah, blah. But now SEEG, we don't have these volumes. And here basically, the idea is it possible that we can develop a system which then automatically would extract the same patient types from a huge database, and that database can have thousands of data sets. It doesn't really matter. You press the button, you get similar cases, and then you can see at that time what happened to that patient, how were they treated, and what was the outcome, and maybe that can help you make your decision for your current patient. Now, as a prototype that this could be doable is we created the seizure matching system. And what we did do here, this is for intracranial EEG, as you can see, is, so the motivation was, can we develop such a system? And then is this system working at a comparable level to different experts, right? Because we know that no two experts will have a totally identical, but a close opinion. And so that was the goal of the project. And that's just here an example where then basically raters were shown examples and then asked, how do you rate that? Is it a little bit similar? Is there similarity? Is there high similarity? Is there no similarity? That was basically the job of many of those seizures to be done. Now, we had a total of 8 experts, and what we made sure is that we didn't choose any 2 experts who trained at the identical school. So these are raters from Europe, from the US, Canada, different places. And so we had 8 raters, and what we could find between the rate, and I think that's pretty good for SEG. We had a moderate inter-rater agreement at 74%. So this is something that we would expect. I think it's not surprising. And basically, we achieve pretty similar value also with our model. And then what we did, and that's something we added in the review process, one of the reviewers, he said, well, you know, but implantation schemes are so different from site to site. So could you have at least a couple of cases from different centers? So then we organized that, but we also found that it performed pretty stable. Now one has to say, evidently, this is now the pure ictal SEG signature that we have. Evidently, a patient is much more than an ictal SEG signature, but it's a first step to illustrate how such a system in theory could work. And what we would need, we need that automatic system, because evidently if you have thousands, you cannot do that manually anymore. I think there is a high need. Not every center has lifelong experience. And then we need huge databases, right? Because it's less likely that it's the mesiotemporal case that we need prior experience. I think that we gathered all ourselves a lot, but then more the rare cases. So we need thousands of cases to see. Now, this is realistic, right? There are now these coming up platforms. The one is from eBrains from the European Union, the Human Intracerebral EEG platform, and the other one is the epilepsy.science platform out of Penn with Brian Lipp and Joost Wagenaar. So these data platforms are coming, are up and running. And so we have all basically that we need. We now just need to build this model. Now, there are other indications for which something like that could be used. Basically, any indication where large database searches might be useful. It's also something. I was at the recent AI meeting in Breckenridge, and their NeuroPace company showed that they now have a very similar approach for optimizing RNS stimulation parameter settings. Could also be used for individual drug selection for epilepsy treatment, for example. Now, let's wrap up. So SEG 2025. Now, current practice is heterogeneous. It varies around the globe. Interpretation is done visually by SEG experts. I'm not saying this is bad, but there is huge variability. It's still objective. We have all our own impressions. The emphasis is, I think, on analysis of seizures. Individual experts learn from their own experience, but not from the overall picture that is available. And I really hope in 10 years, we have a standardized terminology. I think that's really very realistic. We have a fully quantitative description of SEG that then gets supervised by clinicians. I personally would like that a lot, because then I could read maybe 20 studies instead of one. So that could be quite good. I really hope that the inter-ictal EEG alone will make it happen to go to surgery, and that we no longer need to record seizures. That would make it really efficient, and that we have that patient matching system to augment learning experience from past cases with AI-assisted models for clinical decision making. Now, I don't think that this is science fiction. Basically, there are centers out that I just show here what we implemented after I arrived at Duke. So for every patient gets a quantitative SEG report, and that's basically an automatic pipeline that we have set up for our center, where then basically you get fully automatic the different location of the electrodes and the probability that you record from a certain target. Evidently, in case of large malformations, you need to carefully check that makes sense, but at least it makes it much faster than to localize. And then the next step is what we then build is we compute all our different markers, and then we basically plot it, as you can see here. So in that plot, you have here the max and this max and this max, which all nicely lines up to be at the same localization, which is always a good thing. And then for every patient, we have that spatial perturbation map as well for implantation accuracy. But evidently you can add whatever you wish to add and create then this quantitative reports. And then that is something that at the end of the seizure conference is shown, and then the clinician can do with it whatever they feel is good to do with it. Now, with that, I would like to thank our team at Duke and evidently our lab. It's a lot of work. Not a single person can accomplish that. Our funding and you for your attention. Thank you for your kind invitation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frauscher. So how, the regular use of the quantitative analysis in your practice that you've been able to implement at Duke, how easy or difficult was it for you to do that at Duke?
Easy. For me, it was, well, it's not easy.
So the quantitative analysis of the individual markers, is that the codes that are they all available in your repository you could use?
Let me think. Yes, they are. They are all available. They are available either in our lab's GitHub repository, or they are available in the MRI Atlas. There is the HFO detector code. We have other codes as well, but they are all available. Now you still need to implement them. And that might often be the crux. And evidently you need to get the signal out of your clinical system, because you still want, at least at the beginning, because we had already the same process. I did the same in Montreal, but then when we arrived at Duke, you still want to verify, does it still make sense? So then you need to replot the detections just to see, does it make sense? But there was no issue. It was very easy to transfer from that point of view. And then you need to build the pipelines, and then it all sounds good, but you need to troubleshoot as well. But I think that's more from the technical part comes the heavy lifting to get all the data in the formats you need. So that's a process. But now, from the clinician side, I think it was pretty well accepted, and they like to have that available. But again, it's some extra effort.
Schön, toll. Ich bin ein bisschen erschlagen. So I'm a little overwhelmed by all these tools I've never heard about. What about this accuracy of the implantation tool? Is it manual or like visual and gamma, or is that also automatic?
Right, a finger press. It's a push button basically. So it's all, so basically it's set up in a way, it's all done fully automatically. Evidently, it matters the input, right? So you need to select, I think for this project, what we used, I think 20 or 30 minutes of non-REM sleep data. I think that's what we used. And evidently that you select where you don't have artifacts and you throw away channels with artifacts, right? But other than that, so it's not a lot of preparation, what you not anyway could easily do when you anyway need to scroll your traces. You just take that snippet, and that's what we do at our center, right? The fellows just put a snippet and then put it on our server, and then we let it run for them. So it's all fully automatic. I think, because otherwise it would be a lot of work and probably not very reproducible across people, because again, the spike gamma, I think there it helps really to look at the time frequency plot to really differentiate true spike gamma from a filtering effect from the spike. You can see that, particularly if you have poly spike, it always looks like it might be the spike gamma if you just use a regular 30 Hertz filter. So you need to be careful with that. But the way how it was applied and how is the code is I think nicely annotated on our GitHub, and basically you just put that in. Evidently what you need to know is also the coordinates of your electrodes, right? Because you need two things for this spatial perturbation framework. You need the spike gamma detected, plus you need the MRI coordinates. That's the two things, which probably is available depending on how you co-register the electrodes and what system you use.
How long?
It's very fast. Couple of minutes, I think.
There's one question in the chat. They're asking, do you see implanting thalamic nuclei to aid determining which area target neurostimulation in case resection is not possible, becoming a regular part of SEEG?
It's a good question, and you ask different people, and people have different opinions. And I don't want to voice my opinion. I can just say that at many centers now in the US, it's done routinely, including our center. I am still wondering. I don't think we have the final answer. Evidently, we know, and that's nice work from the group of Fabrice Bartholomé from Marseille, that if you have an early involvement of the thalamus, then it's a less likely candidate for a good resection outcome. So that's one argument you can make. And then for the target selection for neuromodulation, I'm also wondering how much more does it bring on the place to what we already know from human primates, how the thalamus, certain parts of the thalamus are connected to certain cortical regions. So I think, I think we need to have more information, and some centers, I saw some first abstract who then tried during the EMU state to already stimulate the certain regions and then look at the acute effect, how much that then determines the long-term effect. I don't know. I just think in general, it doesn't matter if it's the thalamus implant or the motor cortex or the visual cortex. I just think every electrode needs to be well justified, because usually nothing goes wrong with SEEG. However, sometimes things go wrong, and then sometimes they go very wrong, and then it's better to have all electrodes well justified. I think, the way how we approach it, we are not specifically putting the electrode in the thalamus, but it's a patient, we already explore a certain region, and then we push it a bit further to target. So it's not an additional electrode, but I think it's still controversial, but I think it's becoming more and more practice, and hopefully by doing that, in a couple of years we will find out more if that's really the way to go, how to determine which target to implant for neuromodulation.